The heroine of today's story is 23-year-old Rachel Jane Nichol. She was born on November 23, 1968, in the family of Andrew and Monica in Essex County, England. From childhood, the kind and generous Rachel loved taking care of babies living nearby or helping elderly people. Nature had endowed the girl with talent. She sang beautifully, studied acting, and danced in a ballet studio. Teachers predicted a future on stage for her, believing that Nichol could make a successful career in the arts. However, Rachel chose a different path. She was earning a degree in English literature while working part-time as a model and as a lifeguard at a swimming pool in Richmond. At the age of 19, Nichol met 25-year-old Andre Hanscom. Their communication quickly turned into a romantic relationship. Already after the first date, the girl called her mother Monica and said that she had met the man of her dreams. Soon after the start of the relationship, Rachel found out she was pregnant. The pregnancy was a shock for them because the young people had not yet planned to have children. But in the end, after weighing all the pros and cons, they decided in favor of the baby. Rachel moved into Andre's apartment in Battersea in South London, and on August 11th, 1989, their son Alex was born, full name Alexander Lewis Hanscom. The young parents were over the moon with happiness. Rachel completely devoted herself to caring for her son, putting her education on the back burner. Although in her heart she had always dreamed of a career on television, the role of a mother also really suited her. Rachel's family consisted of her partner Andre, son Alex, and their dog named Molly, a cross between a Labrador and a Greyhound. They called themselves a little pack and lived in perfect harmony. The young woman was making big plans for life, but everything changed on July 15th, 1992. This day began like any other, but ended in tragedy. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. That day, Andre went to work, while Rachel and 2-year-old Alex started their day with a morning walk with the dog Molly. Usually, they walked different routes, and this time they chose Wimbledon Common, a huge open space in southwest London. Wimbledon Common, with a total area of 460 hectares, was a vast area with forest tracks, various bodies of water, and zones for informal recreation. It was a specially protected natural territory where natural flora and fauna predominated. On hot summer weekends, this unique place attracted thousands of visitors. However, on the morning of Wednesday, July 15th, 1992, it was quite quiet and not crowded there. Although most of the territory of Wimbledon Common was an open plain, there were several wooded areas. Rachel and Alex walked cheerfully along a wide path, with Molly running ahead. Everything was calm until suddenly there was a feeling that someone was watching them. Mother and son simultaneously looked back and saw a man with a black bag over his shoulder heading toward them. The stranger, approaching, grabbed Alex and pushed him face down into the dirt. Then he pulled out a knife and stabbed Rachel several times with it. And Alex, who had only a couple of weeks left until his 3rd birthday, still remembers this attack to this day. When he got up, his mom was lying motionless nearby. The boy saw the attacker walk up to the stream and wash the blood off his face. Rachel, who had fallen silent on the ground, looked peaceful, as if she were sleeping. The baby tugged at his mother's clothes, cried, and called out, "Wake up, Mommy, wake up!" But despite his young age, he soon realized that Mommy had fallen asleep forever and would never wake up again. Alex ran back along the path they had walked with Rachel just a few minutes earlier. Bursting out of the wooded area into the open space, he saw passers-by who immediately understood that the boy needed help. His dirt-covered face had tear tracks, and his hands, with which he had hugged his mom, were red. The police were called to the scene immediately. Alex was given a sedative and taken to the hospital. News of the attack spread like wildfire and instantly became nationwide. The mass media reported non-stop about the incident. Reporters gathered around Wimbledon Common and kept watch outside the hospital where little Alex was. It soon became clear that although other visitors were in Wimbledon Common that morning, the only witness to the attack was one person, Rachel's 2-year-old son. Andre was at work when he was informed of the tragedy. The police contacted the man and told him that his 2-year-old son was in the hospital. A frightened Andre immediately headed there. He was so attached to Rachel that he could not imagine life without her. On the way to the hospital, the man went over in his head various ways to painlessly leave this world together with Alex to follow Rachel. He did not want to live without her and did not understand how the child would cope with the loss of the closest person. At the hospital, a child psychologist prepared Andre for the meeting with his son and explained how to properly tell the boy that his mother had died. But little Alex already understood without this that he would never see his mother again, would never go for a walk with her, and would never fall asleep on her lap again. He had seen his mom lying on the ground and not moving. She had died and was now watching over him from heaven. Meanwhile, the police at Wimbledon Common were questioning people who had been in the park that morning. It soon turned out that no one had seen the attacker, covered in the victim's blood, leaving the crime scene. And this was surprising, considering that there were about 500 people in the park. When detectives first examined the crime scene, they noticed a scrap of paper on Rachel's forehead, an old receipt from a store. At first, they were puzzled by this fact, but later found out that the receipt had fallen out of Rachel's pocket during the attack. Little Alex had picked it up from the ground and placed it on his mother's head, thinking it was a band-aid or bandage that could heal the wounds and make his mom wake up. The victim's body was sent for autopsy, which showed that she had been subjected to sexual assault and had received about 49 stab wounds. One of them had been inflicted across the neck and had almost decapitated the woman. There were practically no clues at the crime scene. The investigators could not find any DNA traces, as at that time in the early 90s, the technology was very limited. Forensic experts collected samples from Rachel's body, assuming it could be DNA, but due to the limitations of forensic examination at the time, they could not accurately determine the nature of the samples, so this data turned out to be useless. Identifying criminals by DNA was not yet possible then. There were no witnesses other than 2-year-old Alex. Apart from a shoe print found at the scene and traces of red paint on the boy's hair of unknown origin, the detectives found nothing. All this indicated that the investigation would be difficult. One thing was clear: the criminal needed to be found as soon as possible, since he was very dangerous. Apparently, the attacker was not acquainted with Rachel and seemed to have chosen the victim at random. There was a high probability that sooner or later he would strike again and take someone else's life. The day after the tragedy, Rachel's partner Andre appeared on television with an appeal to the public to report any information about the suspected rapist. And this step yielded results. The police received hundreds of phone calls, but none of them led to significant leads. The only person who had really seen the criminal's face and could help identify him was little Alex, but he was only 2 years old. Due to his age, he could not describe the stranger who had attacked his mom. To obtain at least some information about the crime, the police installed recording devices and cameras in the house of Alex's grandparents, where he had to live after Rachel's death. This was done in case the child accidentally remembered something and talked about the sad events of that day. Detectives visited Alex and his father Andre very often to try to extract the necessary information from the child. During these visits, they used various dolls to help Alex find words to describe the attacker's appearance. For example, one doll had white skin, another had black skin, a third had gray hair, a fourth had brown hair, and so on. The officers showed the boy the dolls and asked if any of them looked like the man who had hurt his mom. Together with his father and 2 detectives, Alex also visited a psychologist, where he played with toys and colored pictures. The specialist tried to talk to the child so that he would remember the details of the attack. But the little boy did not want to talk about this topic. He wanted to play and stubbornly tried to drown out the psychologist's voice by banging toys on the table. Experiencing what he had seen and then discussing it again and again with detectives and psychologists was agonizing for him. It was obvious that all this was done with good intentions. The police were trying to catch the criminal, but the child simply did not want to hear anything and did not want to remember the day when his mom left him forever. In the end, the detectives still managed to get a fairly detailed description of the attacker from Alex. He said it was a white man with a short haircut, dressed in a white button-up shirt with a collar. For some reason, according to the child, the belt was worn over the shirt rather than threaded through the loops. The man was wearing blue trousers and brown boots. He was carrying a black bag. Alex described the stranger as he remembered him. Unfortunately, given the child's age, the detectives could not fully rely on the description he gave. Due to the stress he had experienced, the boy's memories could have been significantly distorted. Nevertheless, this description gave at least some idea of what the attacker looked like. The press actively covered this case, thereby adding stress to Alex's family. He became known as the boy who saw his mother being stabbed to death. Journalists desperately tried to talk to Andre and Alex to photograph them, so they constantly kept watch near the house. At Rachel's funeral, Alex had to cover his face with a baseball cap so that the intrusive reporters would not bother the boy. At this time, detectives were questioning eyewitnesses, taking hundreds of statements, and trying to narrow down the circle of suspects, but there was a catastrophic lack of evidence. It was then that they turned to criminal profiling specialist Paul Britton with a request to create a psychological portrait of the criminal based on his behavior and the details of the attack, so that potential suspects could later be identified using this profile. Paul Britton suggested that the person who had taken Rachel Nichols' life was a man aged about 20 to 30, a local resident of the Wimbledon Common area, as he most likely knew the area well, possibly single or living with his parents. This person watched a lot of adult films, was dominant in intimate relationships, and dreamed of realizing his cruel fantasies. He most likely did not have a girlfriend, but in the past, he had minor offenses related to violence. The detectives used Paul's profile, Alex's description, and eyewitness statements to create a composite sketch of the main suspect. Out of the many tips received from the public, only one was confirmed as more or less reliable. This testimony was provided by a woman named Jamie. She reported that on the morning of Rachel Nichols' death, she had seen a man with a dog on Wimbledon Common who was behaving suspiciously. Jamie noticed that the stranger looked confused, did not know where he was going, and avoided her gaze. Every time she tried to look him in the eyes, he turned away. A few minutes later, Jamie saw the man again. This time, he was following some woman across the heath. This seemed strange and suspicious to Jamie, especially after it became known about the attack on Rachel. As a result, Jamie helped create a composite sketch, and her testimony made this man the main suspect in the Nicholl case. After the resulting image of the alleged criminal was shown to the general public, calls began to come into the police from people who recognized neighbors, friends, or former classmates in the photo. At the same time, everyone named different names, but the name Colin was mentioned most often. In 1992, Colin Stagg was 29 years old. He lived with his dog in an apartment in Wimbledon, less than 1.5 kilometers from the place where 23-year-old Rachel Nicholl was killed. At that time, he was unemployed and avoided contact with neighbors. The police quickly established that Colin Stagg had indeed been on Wimbledon Common on the day the mother and son were attacked. Many people thought that Colin looked similar to the composite sketch. As a result, he became the main suspect in the case of the murder of Rachel Nicholl. When the police turned their attention to Colin, about 2 months had passed since the attack. By that time, the case had received wide publicity. All this time, the detectives investigating the crime were under strong pressure from the public, frightened that the maniac was still at large, and under the close attention of the press, which demanded that the criminal be found. The authorities wanted to solve this case as soon as possible, and even though they had no evidence against Colin Stagg, they decided that he fit the description drawn up by Paul Britton, and therefore could well be responsible for the attack. To gather evidence, the police organized an operation codenamed Edel. What had Colin Stagg been doing on July 15, 1992, when Rachel died? Early in the morning, the man had been walking his dog on the heath near Wimbledon Common. Usually they wandered around the area for a long time, but that day he had a severe headache, so Colin decided to shorten the route. At home, the man took a painkiller and lay down for a while. While he was in his apartment, Rachel Nicholl and her son Alex took the dog Molly and went to Wimbledon Common, where they were soon attacked by an unknown man. When the medicine took effect and the headache subsided, Colin decided to take the dog out again, as she was desperately asking to go outside. By the time he reached Wimbledon Common, Rachel's body had already been found. Police were swarming everywhere. Officers were guarding the crime scene and not allowing anyone to approach. One of the detectives stopped Colin and asked him to give his name and address. Stagg provided the information without any problem and said that he had been on the heath that morning, but had not seen anyone or noticed anything suspicious. About 2 months passed before, in September 1992, the police raided Colin's apartment in Wimbledon and informed him that he was a suspect in the attack on Rachel Nichol. During the search of the apartment, several items were found that seemed inappropriate to the detectives. Drawings resembling satanic symbols hung on the walls. Colin explained that the drawings belonged to his brother, who had lived in the apartment before him. His brother was into heavy rock and depicted his emotions in the form of strange symbols, and Colin simply had not bothered to remove them after moving in. According to some sources, books on the occult, gloves, and a knife in a sheath were also found in the apartment. One way or another, Colin was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. He was in shock, as he had never had problems with the law before. The police questioned the man for 3 days, and Stagg told them everything he could. He claimed that he was not involved in the attack. The detectives also looked into previous incidents. In the summer before Rachel's death, one woman had reported to the police that she had seen a man resembling Colin Stagg on the heath. He was naked. When questioned by investigators, Colin admitted that he did indeed sunbathe naked on the heath every summer, because the place was often used by other nudists. With no other evidence, the authorities decided to charge Colin with indecent behavior. He was fined £200 and released. It seemed he had gotten away with it, but things were not so simple. Now the police, the mass media, and the public viewed this man as a sex offender. They considered him a pervert who exposed himself to the public. The press followed Colin almost everywhere. He was filmed and photographed, and these pictures were sold to newspapers. The public was indignant that the criminal who had taken Rachel Nichol's life had been released. At the same time, the authorities were determined to prove Colin Stagg's guilt and focused all their efforts on this. They no longer considered other suspects. At this time, a woman named Julie Pines contacted the police. She said she had some information about Colin. Julie had seen his photographs in the newspapers and decided to tell about an incident that had occurred between them about 2 years earlier. Julie had placed an ad in the newspaper in the Lonely Hearts column. It was the printed version of modern dating sites. The ad included her name, age, interests, and phone number. Colin Stagg saw Julie's ad and responded to it. He was also single, so he decided to try to find a girlfriend through the newspaper. The young people talked on the phone several times, and Colin thought everything was going well. He even began to think that their friendly relationship might at some point move to a new level. Stagg even wrote a letter to Julie in which he shared his intimate fantasies about contact in nature. The woman did not like the letter and stopped communicating with Colin. However, she kept the message and, 2 years later, when Stagg became the main suspect in the attack on Rachel, decided to hand it over to the police. However, the letter was not direct evidence of the author's guilt, as it had been written 2 years before the crime. Nevertheless, it gave the detectives additional grounds to believe that Colin might be involved in the murder. So, all the evidence against Stagg at that time was circumstantial. To charge him, the police needed solid evidence, and the detective team, including criminal profiling specialist Paul Britton, developed Operation Edel. An attractive blonde with the fictional name Lizzie James, in reality an undercover policewoman, was supposed to get close to Colin, seduce him, and try to make him confess to the crime. Lizzie James, introducing herself as a friend of Julie Pines from the Lonely Hearts column, wrote a letter to Stagg. In it, she expressed a desire to get to know the man better. Lizzie admitted that she had read his letter in which he had shared his intimate fantasies with Julie and that she had liked it. Suspecting nothing, Colin was very flattered, as he had never had much success with the opposite sex. In his messages, he tried to be romantic and expressed a desire to invite Lizzie on a date, for a walk where they could have a glass of wine, and maybe afterward he would kiss her. Stagg admitted that he had never had intimate relations with anyone before. All this sounded very modest and innocent, while Lizzie's letters were the complete opposite. The woman described her dark, intimate desires in minute detail. She wrote that she wanted a man to make her feel defenseless and humiliated. As Lizzie became more and more explicit in her messages, Colin did the same in response. Eventually, he wrote that he would like to spend the night with her, but immediately apologized for his words. Despite Lizzie encouraging him to be more harsh and uninhibited, Stagg apologized at the end of every letter and said, "I'm very sorry if I crossed the line. I'm sorry if I went too far." Colin and Lizzie exchanged more than 40 letters, but the police still did not have the evidence needed to charge Stagg with the murder, so they decided to intensify the operation. Lizzie called her chosen one, but could not extract any incriminating evidence from him. All conversations were recorded, but Colin never mentioned Rachel Nichol, and then the detectives decided to organize a meeting. It was risky because, in essence, they were sending an undercover policewoman to meet a very dangerous man. The investigators believed that Colin was the criminal who had attacked the mother and child. They needed to make sure Lizzie would be safe, so all meetings took place in public places. Colin and Lizzie first met in Hyde Park in London. The woman was wearing a recording device so that the detectives could listen to their conversations. And nearby, there were always other plainclothes officers in case of an emergency. Over the next few months, Colin and Lizzie met several times. During one of these meetings, Lizzie told a story about how she had had a boyfriend who was into black magic and that she had participated in the human sacrifice of a pregnant woman. Deep down, Colin thought Lizzie was crazy, but since he really liked her, he wanted to get her into bed. He simply ignored this creepy story. But the police saw alarming signals in Stagg's behavior, because any normal person hearing something like that would have been shocked. And Colin, in their opinion, showed no reaction. Then, Lizzie started a conversation with Colin about the attack on Rachel Nichol and confessed that she had always dreamed of being in the victim's place. She assured him that she would actually like it if Colin turned out to be the criminal, and even promised to arrange a night of love on the condition that he confessed to attacking the mother and son. The fact was that the detectives were desperately trying to force a confession out of the man. But Stagg claimed that he was innocent and had nothing to do with it. He honestly told Lizzie, "Sorry, but I didn't do it. I didn't take Rachel's life." Colin, in order to win Lizzie's favor, did indeed come up with a couple of terrible stories about supposedly attacking a woman with a knife in the park. But he continued to claim that he had nothing to do with Nichol's death and had simply made up those stories. Soon, Colin completely lost interest in Lizzie. He wanted to spend the night with her, but it became clear to him that this would not happen until he confessed to a crime he had not committed. One day, the man simply stopped responding. In total, they communicated for about 7 months, and Stagg never once admitted that he had been involved in Rachel's death. Nevertheless, on August 17th, 1993, a year after the crime, 30-year-old Colin was arrested on suspicion of attacking Rachel Nichol. He was taken to the police station and questioning began. The detectives told him about Operation Edel, which had been conducted for 7 months with the aim of catching him. The undercover policewoman, Lizzie James, was brought into the room, and the letters Colin had written to her were read out. Realizing that he had fallen into a trap, the man refused to give any comments. Colin's case was sent to court, and he himself was sent to prison. Stagg remained in custody for more than a year before the trial began. The evidence of his guilt consisted of the materials collected during Operation Edel and the profile of the criminal drawn up by Paul Britton. However, the prosecution had neither direct evidence, nor forensic examination, nor the murder weapon. Soon after the start of the trial, the judge ruled that the evidence collected during Operation Edel, including the letters and recordings of conversations, was inadmissible because the way it had been obtained was unfair to Colin. During the covert operation, the defendant had simply been forced to talk about his cruel, intimate fantasies. The judge said that the police had shown excessive zeal and had tried to accuse Stagg using the crudest methods of deception. As a result, the case was closed, and Colin was officially acquitted and released. Although Operation Edel was later criticized by the media, many publications continued to consider Stagg the criminal despite the acquittal. In 1994, Andre Hanscom, the common-law husband of the deceased Rachel, and his son Alex moved to France. They were forced to hide from the intrusive pursuit of the press. Once, a photographer managed to take a picture of little Alex, which was published in a newspaper. This created a serious danger to the boy's life, since Alex was the only witness to the attack on his mother, and the criminal, who was still at large, could come after him. Andre understood that Alex needed a normal life and did not want his childhood to be overshadowed by constant media attention. To ensure his son's safety, he took the child and secretly moved to France. Although Stagg was acquitted, the police did not look for new suspects, still considering Colin guilty. Moreover, a huge amount of time and £3 million sterling had been spent on Operation Edel. It turned out that all this money had been wasted. For many years, the case remained unsolved. In 2002, on the 10th anniversary of Rachel Nichols' death, Scotland Yard created a new team of detectives for a reinvestigation. They reviewed all the evidence and witness statements, and also took DNA samples from Andre and Alex, who by that time was 13 years old. A tiny particle, presumably DNA, had been found on Rachel's body, but due to the limited technology of the time, the results had been inconclusive. Now, with the development of forensics, it became possible to re-examine the samples taken from the victim's body and conduct a more accurate analysis. To identify the criminal, the DNA sample was compared with Colin Stagg's DNA. The results showed similarity, but in 2002, the technology still did not allow precise identification of the person. Only 2 years later, repeated tests confirmed that Colin Stagg's DNA did not match the unknown sample, and this became important evidence of his innocence. The test results were entered into the database, and in 2004, 12 years after Rachel Nichols' death, a match was established with the DNA of a man named Robert Napper. This was a 38-year-old convicted criminal who was being held in a psychiatric hospital in Berkshire, England. Robert Clive Napper was born on February 25, 1966. He was the eldest of 4 children and grew up in a violent environment. His father often attacked his mother, and little Robert witnessed constant conflicts and fights. When the boy was 9 years old, his parents divorced. The children were placed in temporary foster care. A visit to a child psychiatrist ended with a diagnosis. It turned out that Robert suffered from Asperger's syndrome. Later, in his teenage years, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a mental illness that affects thinking and behavior, as such people's perception of reality is disrupted. Because of this, Robert made strange statements. He claimed that he had met the Queen of England, was a Nobel Prize laureate, and even that soldiers of the Irish Republican Army had captured him, tortured him, and wanted to cut off his fingers. From childhood, it was difficult for Robert to study at school. He did not get along with other children. He had almost no friends, which is why he kept to himself and often became the object of ridicule and bullying from his peers. When Robert was 12 years old, a terrible event occurred in his life. During a hiking trip, he was sexually abused by an adult family friend of the Nappers. The man was arrested and sent to prison, but after the assault, Robert's already difficult character became even worse. The teenager completely withdrew into himself, became obsessed with cleanliness and order, which could indicate the presence of obsessive-compulsive disorder. His behavior became aggressive, especially toward his younger brothers and sisters. He often got into fights, bullied them, and even spied on them. Once Robert was caught peeping at his sister while she was getting dressed. At the age of 16, Napper dropped out of school and enrolled in catering courses. He often changed jobs and did not stay anywhere for long. At the age of 18, his mother kicked him out of the house. The reasons for this action are not entirely clear, but they were probably somehow connected with his aggressive behavior. After that, Robert got a job at a plastics factory and lived in a hostel in Plumstead. In 1986, he was arrested for carrying a loaded air pistol. This was his first criminal offense, and the police limited themselves to a warning. A couple of years later, when Robert turned 20, he began peeping at local women and exposing himself in public. In 1989, Robert Napper carried out a series of attacks on girls in London, for which he received the nickname the Green Chain Rapist. The Green Chain was a series of green paths connecting much of southeast London. The first serious attack occurred in August of that year in Plumstead. The homeowner had accidentally left the back door unlocked. Robert took advantage of the opportunity and broke in while the woman was drying her hair in the bathroom on the second floor, and her children were playing downstairs. The attacker went up the stairs and, threatening her with a knife, forced the housewife to have sexual intercourse with him. If she refused, the man threatened to harm her children. After the rapist fled, the woman immediately contacted the police, and experts managed to extract a DNA sample of the attacker from the semen. Soon after this, Robert Napper confessed to his biological mother about the crime he had committed. Without hesitation, she called the police and told them everything. However, for some reason, the detectives did not show proper interest in her statement, and Robert remained free. The negligence of the authorities allowed him to continue his crimes, and his mother forever cut her son out of her life, stopping all contact with him. In the following years, Robert sexually assaulted several more women. Most of the attacks occurred on the Green Chain, in the system of open spaces and paths in southeast London. Napper wandered around parks, watching women and looking for victims. Over time, the attacks became increasingly brutal, and many victims mentioned the presence of a cold weapon. In one case, Robert stabbed a woman in the chest with a knife, but she survived. The exact number of Robert Napper's victims is unknown. Different sources give different figures, from several dozen to 100. When he was finally caught, he was convicted of only 2 acts of violence and 2 attempts. However, it is believed that he committed many more crimes. Many women reported the attacks to the police, but their complaints were not properly investigated. After several statements from victims, forensic experts were able to identify the attacker's DNA from his semen. A composite sketch of the criminal was also created and published in the hope that someone would recognize the Green Chain Rapist and contact the police. And that is what happened. After the publication of the composite sketch, Napper's neighbors contacted the authorities. Robert was asked to come to the police station and provide a DNA sample, but he did not show up. Then, the detectives asked him to come in for an interview again, but he did not appear a second time. It was incredible, but the police refused to take further action. Robert's behavior was simply left without attention. If the detectives had shown vigilance, other crimes might not have happened. Instead, having calmly avoided police pursuit, Napper continued his attacks and eventually moved on to murder. His first victim was 23-year-old young mother Rachel Nichol, whom he stabbed 49 times in front of her 2-year-old son, Alex. The police failed to establish a connection between the attacks on women on the Green Chain and the murder on Wimbledon Common. Despite several similarities, the women were mainly attacked in public places, and the criminal threatened them with a knife. The Green Chain Crimes Investigation Team contacted the team of detectives working on Rachel's case. They suggested that the attacks might be connected. However, the Edel task force was so confident in Colin Stagg's guilt that they saw no connection between the cases and almost refused to investigate. The detectives once again missed the opportunity to catch the real criminal, allowing him to strike again. About 3 months after Rachel Nichol's death, Robert was arrested, but for a completely different reason. He had tried to print copies of police documents on the right to own weapons. Later, the police detained him again after receiving a report from local residents about a stranger who had been looking into their windows. A search was conducted in Napper's apartment in Plumstead. The police found weapons, including pistols and knives. Also, in a red metal toolbox, a geographical map with markings was found. Napper had circled with a marker the places where he had committed attacks and raped his victims. The map was a trophy for him and a reminder of his brutal crimes. However, the police again failed to establish a connection between the cases. Robert was given an 8-week prison sentence for possession of a firearm. After that, he was released, although the court psychiatrist expressed the opinion that Napper posed an immediate threat to himself and society. Everything went unpunished for Robert. First the countless attacks on women on the Green Chain, and now the murder of Rachel Nichol. After being released from prison following the 8-week sentence, Napper continued to commit his crimes. This time, he again chose a mother with a child as his victim. For some time, Robert had been watching their house. 27-year-old Samantha Bissay and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine lived in Plumstead. Samantha's partner Conrad said that one night they had indeed noticed a man on the street looking into the windows. Napper was simply waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. This opportunity presented itself in November 1993, when Conrad went to spend the night at his father's house, and Samantha and her daughter stayed home. Breaking into the apartment by deception, Robert stabbed the woman several times in the chest and neck with a knife, and then subjected her to sexual violence. The attack was brutal. Samantha's body was mutilated. The criminal, as the subsequent autopsy showed, took part of the victim's stomach wall with him as a trophy. But that was not the worst part, because after killing the mother, Robert made his way into Jasmine's room, sexually assaulted her, and then suffocated her. The victims' bodies were discovered the next morning by Samantha's partner. According to available data, the crime scene was so horrific that the police photographer assigned to take pictures in Samantha Bissay's apartment had to take long-term leave after what he saw. Detectives examined the fingerprints in the rooms and established that they all belonged to the people who lived in the apartment. Most likely, the attacker had been wearing gloves, but after re-examining the evidence, one more fingerprint was found. A check against the police database showed that it belonged to Napper. Also, in Samantha's house, a bloody footprint was noticed that matched Robert's shoes, and a witness was found who had seen a man in the area on the day of the crime. Robert Napper was finally arrested, and in May 1994, he was charged with the attack on Samantha Bissay and her daughter Jasmine. The detectives also considered the possibility that this person could be involved in the series of attacks on women on the Green Chain. The map found in Napper's bedroom, where the attack locations were circled, eventually played its role. It was believed that Robert had committed about 100 sexual assaults, but only 2 attacks and 2 attempts could be proven. It turned out that during the investigation of the Green Chain crimes, Napper had been excluded from the list of suspects because of his height of 188 centimeters. According to the victims' descriptions, the rapist was short, and Robert was remembered as such because he often walked hunched over. In late 1995, Napper was found guilty of the manslaughter of Samantha and Jasmine Bissay on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital for an indefinite period, and only in 2004 was the DNA sample from the body of the deceased Rachel Nikhil entered into the database. It matched Napper's DNA, who was already being held in a secure facility. This was not the only evidence linking Robert to the attack on Rachel. When detectives searched his belongings, they found a red metal box under the bed containing knives and a map of the area. The map marked the locations of the attacks, including Wimbledon Common, where Rachel had been killed. Little Alex, who had become the only witness to the crime, had traces of red paint left in his hair, the origin of which could not be established. It turned out that it matched the paint on the box where Napper kept his tools. More than 16 years later, justice was restored, and the victim's family was able to achieve justice. Robert Napper was found guilty of the murder of Rachel Nichol. However, this case revealed numerous mistakes by the Metropolitan Police, who failed to detain the criminal even when his own mother reported the first attack on a woman in the house. It was this that led to the tragic consequences, and the police offered official apologies to the victims' families. Colin Stagg, who had been falsely accused of the murder and disgraced throughout the country because of his intimate fantasies, received compensation of more than £700,000. He spent 14 months in prison awaiting trial, and even after his acquittal, for many years, Colin Stagg was subjected to attacks from the authorities and the press. Everyone considered him an evil monster who had attacked a young mother with a child. The public hated him, and newspapers and other media constantly printed nasty things about him. The undercover law enforcement officer Lizzie James, who had been hired to extract a confession from Colin Stagg, later took early retirement and sued the Metropolitan Police. The lawsuit claimed that she had suffered serious psychological trauma as a result of the forced actions during Operation Edel. In 2001, Lizzie received a payment of £125,000. This decision caused widespread criticism from the public. Many believed that the payment was unfair and did not correspond to the scale of the harm caused. The son of the deceased Rachel Nickel, Alexander Louis Hanscom, and his father, Andre Hanscom, shared their memories in a book in which they talked about their life after the tragedy. Despite the dark thoughts of voluntary departure that had haunted Andre immediately after his wife's death, the man found the strength to live on, raised his son, and managed to maintain optimism. And the grown-up Alexander still keeps in his memory that terrible day that took his mother away from him forever. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.